I'm going to move on now to Helen Yaffe, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow, the author of We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, amongst other books. And she's also the co-producer of several documentaries on Cuba, including Cuba's Life Task and Cuba and COVID-19, Public Health, Science and Solidarity. I'm sure the links are getting posted in the chat. So over to you, Helen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sam, and thank you so much to Vijay and Johanna. Wonderful introductions. Hard to follow up. I'm afraid I'm going to slip into lecturer mode and use a PowerPoint, but it's also quite useful visually. So if you can confirm that you can see that. Can you see that?
Yep, you're all good.
Hold on, I'm going to try that again because that was the wrong screen. All right, try that one. How's that? And if I do big screen, can you see it big screen or small? Do I need to swap?
Big screen, you're okay.
Great. Okay. So now quite a bit of what I was going to say has already been mentioned. Sam in the introduction and repeated by Johanna talked about this memorandum, which really laid the basis for US policy towards Cuba in April 1960. So before the US blockade is implemented, before even Cuba has declared it's a socialist state. And, you know, it's astonishing. Go and look at it. It's a one-page document. It starts by recognizing that the Cuban Revolution, the leadership has mass support. And then it recognizes the growing influence of communism and communist ideas. And it says that the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment, disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. This lays the basis for what's known as a two-track policy. First of all, create economic difficulty to create suffering. And in the words of this document lower down, you can see it's highlighted in red, to weaken the economic life of Cuba, denying money and supplies, to increase monetary and real wages. And here's the crux, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. So the track 2 is to use that difficulty, the suffering that you've created through economic weapons to foster an internal opposition. Okay, now some of us use the term blockade and some embargo, but there is actually a politics behind this. The people in the US tend to use the term embargo. What's the difference? I thought I'd lay this out now because it's linked to the question of whether it's a bilateral or extraterritorial issue. An embargo is when one nation establishes a policy not to trade with another nation and not to allow its territory to be used for commerce with that nation. It's the prerogative of any nation. A blockade is when a country uses military threat or military force to close the borders of another entity to international commerce. And here's the crux, to prevent normal commercial activity with third parties, with other countries. A blockade is an act of war. Now, these are some of the main laws and regulations that constitute the blockade. People need to get their head around this. It's not just one law. It's overlapping complex legislation. The first piece of legislation used to introduce the blockade, not introduced in 1917, but a 1917 piece of legislation in the United States, the Trading with the Enemy Act. Now, that was introduced in the context of the First World War, and it included many countries. Cuba is now, as I understand it, the only country still included in the Trading with the Enemy Act. I'm glad to see Johanna's nodding when I say that. And then you can see this escalation, accumulation of new rules that are introduced, laws that are introduced. There are 6 main legal statutes, but then in addition, there's more regulations that are not necessarily take the status of laws. And you can see how it increases. But notice also how the laws of the blockade are introduced in moments of crisis for Cuba. So the early period before Cuba is established in the Soviet trading, a socialist countries trading bloc, and then really hammering Cuba in its special period of economic crisis after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Cuba's GDP falls 35%. So wherever there's weakness or crisis, using that, as Johanna Tablada said they did with COVID, to try and push Cuba into, into crisis. and also targeting Cuba's key economic sectors, targeting tourism, targeting sugar exports initially, targeting biotechnology, targeting, you know, the ability to tackle COVID. Now, in 2017, when Trump came in, his administration introduced, as Johanna already said, 243 new actions, sanctions and coercive measures on a blockade that was already 6 decades long, that many of us thought, you know, could not be tightened. And more than 50 of those was during the global COVID pandemic, when international organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, asked for the end of sanctions, which targeted countries' ability to tackle the crisis. And what has Biden done? As Johanna said, he's increased sanctions. Now, how is the blockade extraterritorial? Most people think this starts with the 1990s, but actually the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act already prohibited assistance to countries that assist Cuba. So it made already US sanctions against Cuba have an extraterritorial characteristic. This was increased. The Torricelli Act of 1992 prohibits foreign-based subsidiaries of US companies in third countries from trading with Cuba or Cuban nationals, bans foreign ships docking in Cuba from entering US ports for 6 months, denies foreign assistance and debt relief to countries aiding Cuba. The Helms-Burton Act strengthened all of those elements, but also threatened entities and individuals in third countries with legal action and denial of entry into the United States for trafficking in nationalized properties. But there are other regulations. Third country manufacturers cannot export to Cuba any goods containing 20% of US components and must request a license for goods with up to 10% of components. Cuba cannot access technology. US leads in technology, it patents technology. In response to the Helms-Burton Act, Canada, the EU and the UK adopted what's called clawback legislation and blocking legislation. They threatened to take legal action in the WTO, in NAFTA. But then they made a deal. And the deal was that the US would limit the impact of provisions, the Title III specifically, and the EU would freeze legal action. So the US agreed to suspend Title III, where it could sue foreigners for trafficking with Cuba, so long as the EU and other allies, and I'm quoting, continue their stepped up efforts to promote democracy in Cuba. And Cuba, the EU, led by Aznar, the right-wing prime minister, or president, I think, of Spain, adopted what was called the common position, a position of hostility towards Cuba. But this fades away, it gradually disintegrates, and by 2016, so after rapprochement is announced by the presidents of Cuba and the United States under Obama, December 2014, 2016, the EU finally signed a new accord, the Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement. And this was starting to see a great deal of stepping up of engagement, cooperation in things like sustainable development, but also investments and so on. But then we had the Trump era, which starts 1 year later. In 2019, the Trump administration lifted that suspension on Title III. EU and Britain had said they would take it to court. Again, they threatened legal action, but ultimately they took none. And this is why it's left for us to take action. What exactly are the banks scared of? So we know that there's laws in our country that make it illegal for entities to sanction us and other entities outside the US, in Britain, for example, in the EU. But they do it anyway. Why? Because they are more scared of what happens otherwise, and with good reason. Between 2009 and 2015, under Obama's first 6 years, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, which is of the US Treasury, issued a record-breaking 56 fines on foreign entities engaging with Cuba, nearly 14.3 billion in fines. Now, not just Cuba, some of these were accused of trading or facilitating transactions with Iran and other sanctioned countries. But European bank fines for transacting with Cuba, I've got a list of some here. Just look at that. BNP Paribas, 8.9 billion. Commerzbank in Germany, 718 billion. It goes on and on and on. And that was just in the first 6 years. Fines increased, 2.8 billion. More fines were imposed after Obama announced rapprochement, after Obama restored diplomatic relations and said he opposed the US blockade, or embargo as they call it. So the risk of fines means that banks list Cuba among their sanctioned countries. Blocking bank payments means that you're blocking trade in goods and services, you're blocking remittances, you're blocking even, as Sam said, humanitarian donations. The US also applies political pressure on governments, even in relation to Cuban medical assistance. And I would urge you to read the interview that Johanna Tablada did with Rania Khalek, which the link was posted in the chat. So this was the key moment, a malicious act. Days before Trump leaves office, he puts Cuba back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Everyone knows this is a complete farce and a fallacy. But Cuba now automatically for the banks qualifies as high risk for international banks and investors. There are few banks left in the world that will now transact with Cuba without very complex processes having to be pursued. Why? Because banks are risk adverse. They are, and we've seen why when we look at those fines. So Cuba is listed as a sanctioned country, despite the fact that doing so violates laws in the countries where they operate, in Britain and in the EU. Now, this 1 cent for Cuba campaign, or Tell the Banks Unblock Cuba, aims to change the calculation made by banks so that imposing sanctions on Cuba is high risk, not carrying out transactions with Cuba. And the next speaker is going to talk you through how to do it. It's a beautifully simple campaign, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.